welcome to the Deep Dive.
Hello.
This is where we take a source, something you've shared, and really boil it down.
We try to pull out the key insights, the things you really need to know, saving you the legwork.
Exactly. And today, we're digging into a personal reflection guide. It's focused very specifically on Psalm 74, verses 12 to 23.
And our mission here really is to unpack the core idea from this particular source.
Meshes.
It's about how the psalmist, right in the middle of some pretty terrible circumstances, deliberately looks back.
Looks back at God's history.
Right, at God's past actions. And the guide presents this as a crucial way to remember God's still working salvation, even when the present feels, well, bleak.
Okay. So this deep dive is for you listening right now. We're exploring how focusing on these, ancient, powerful acts in a text like Psalm 74 might actually shift your perspective on what's happening today.
Yeah, how history informs the present.
All right, let's get into it. Where does the reflection guide start us off?
It sets the scene, paints a picture based on Psalm 74 itself. It's a context of chaos, real destruction and distress.
Things feel broken, under attack.
Precisely. But then, as the guide points out, there's this pivotal moment, a shift.
The psalmist changes his focus. Intentionally.
Yeah, he stops looking just at the crisis and starts remembering who God is.
And who is that, according to the guide's reading here?
God is presented as, and this is key phrasing from the source, a king who has always been working salvation.
Always working, not just a past reality.
Right. It's ongoing. Historical, yes, but continuous.
And the guide anchors this in verse 12, doesn't it? Psalm 74.112.
It does. Yet God, my king, is from of old, working salvation in the midst of the earth. That's the verse highlighted.
Okay, break that down a bit. What are the key parts there that the guide focuses on?
Well, God, my king, his identity. From of old, his eternal nature, working salvation, his active role. And in the midst of the earth, his presence, his immanence.
Right here. Not somewhere else.
Exactly. It's all there in that one verse.
But, okay, why bring this up when things are so bad? What does the psalm itself say about how bad things actually are? The guide touches on this context, right?
It does, implicitly, by contrast of it with God's power. But the psalm itself, especially later, verses like 18 to 23, is pretty raw.
Yeah.
You've got the enemy scoffing, reviling God's name. That's verse 18.
And verse 20, that was really stark. The dark places of the land are full of the habitations of violence.
It sounds terrifyingly real. Not abstract theological trouble, but actual violence and danger.
And it's constant, isn't it? Verse 23 talks about the clamor of God's foes going up continually, like a constant background noise of opposition.
Yeah, it's loud. It's oppressive. So you have that reality.
Okay, so this declaration in verse 12 about God the King working salvation, it stands against that backdrop. How does the psalmist connect those two? What's the foundation for believing verse 12 when verses 18-23 feel so real?
And that's where the guide points us next, to verses 13 through 17.
The evidence section.
Kind of, yeah. The psalmist doesn't just state God is king. He lists God's credentials, you could say. Specific, powerful, historical acts.
Acts that show dominion over chaos and creation itself.
Exactly.
So what are some examples the reflection guide pulls out from those verses?
Well, verse 13, dividing the sea by your might.
Which immediately brings Exodus to mind, but here it feels like more than just history.
The guide frames it as God's power over these huge, seemingly untamable natural forces.
And then there's the really vivid stuff in 13 and 14, breaking heads of sea monsters, crushing Leviathan.
Yeah, and the guide emphasizes this isn't just like ancient poetry. It's presented as demonstrating God's absolute authority over forces of chaos, evil, opposition, powerful imagery.
Almost violent imagery, actually. Showing complete control.
It really does. And the list goes on, showing control over the basics of nature. Verse 15, splitting open springs, drying up rivers.
So power over water, life-giving water.
Then it zooms out, cosmic scale.
Yeah.
Verse 16, establishing day and night, the sun, the moon, the stars.
Order out of potential chaos. He's the creator.
Right. And then verse 17 brings it back to earth, fixing boundaries, making summer and winter.
Establishing reliable patterns, seasons, the fundamental order of things.
So the guide's point, following the psalmist, is this is the God we're talking about, the one who did all this.
So when the psalmist is looking at the present mess, the violence, the enemies, verse 18-23, he deliberately looks back at this track record, V13 to 17.
Yes. To reinforce who God is, V12. He's reminding himself, and maybe God too, in a way that the God needed now is the same God who demonstrated this immense power then.
Okay, I see the logic. And this is where the reflection guide pivots to us, to you listening.
Exactly. The guide argues that this whole process, this ancient practice of remembering, is vital because it directly challenges that feeling we sometimes get.
That God is silent or just not involved right now.
Yeah, or inactive. The guide pushes back against that. From this perspective, God is always working.
Even if we don't see it, even if the chaos feels like it's winning.
Mm-hmm. The guide insists he hasn't checked out. He's not done. His work of salvation continues right here in the midst of the earth.
And the guide connects this Old Testament idea to the New Testament, right?
It does. It makes a really significant connection, pointing to Jesus' death and resurrection.
As the ultimate example.
As the ultimate proof, you might say, that God works salvation even when things look absolutely hopeless, utterly lost. It links that definitive act back to this theme running through Psalm 74.
Wow. So that grounds the idea that God is still active today. In your life, maybe in your pain or in the waiting periods.
Yes, waiting is a big one the guide mentions. God isn't just watching history unfold from a distance. The reflection suggests he's actively involved, still writing it.
Okay, so remembering the past, VD 13-17, shores up faith in God's identity and present work, even when the current reality looks grim, VD 18-23.
Precisely, and that context of distress is important. It's because of the scoffing, the violence, the clamor that the psalmist cries out in verse 22. Arise, O God, defend your cause.
But it's not just a desperate yell into the void.
No. According to the guide's interpretation, it's a plea rooted in the solid conviction built on remembering. The God who did all that can act now.
And this is where the application comes in for the listener. The reflection guide turns this into direct questions, doesn't it?
It does. It essentially asks you, how does remembering God's power in history challenge your feelings about God's presence or absence today?
Does it make you rethink moments where God feels silent?
Right. And it pushes further. What might it look like for you to trust God's power specifically in your current struggle or your period of waiting based on these ancient examples?
Because the God who crushed Leviathan is the same God today.
That's the connection. So the guide's call to call on him today with bold faith, it's not based on wishful thinking.
It's based on his resume, basically, his track record.
Exactly. A history of working salvation.
And the guide suggests a specific kind of prayer, too.
Yeah, praying for eyes to see God's hand at work, even in the dark, and for hearts that trust his salvation is still unfolding.
So actively connecting that historical memory to navigating the present, using the past to fuel hope now.
That's the bridge the guide builds. History isn't just history, it's the foundation for present trust and future hope.
Okay, so let's try and pull this all together.
Okay.
The main takeaway from this reflection guide on Psalm 74.1223 seems to be this.
Go for it.
When things are falling apart, when chaos seems to reign, the psalmist shows a path. Deliberately remember God's past victories, his control over chaos, his acts of salvation.
Mm-hmm.
And the guide argues this act of remembering isn't just nostalgia, it's meant to be a powerful anchor for your faith now.
Right. It actively counters that feeling that maybe God isn't here or isn't doing anything when you're facing your own difficulties.
It reframes the present in light of the past.
Yeah. Okay, so here's something to chew on, a final thought building on this.
Okay.
The source explicitly links these ancient acts, dividing seas, crushing monsters, the stuff in Psalm 74, with the much later event of Jesus' death and resurrection. It treats them as part of the same ongoing story of salvation.
The whole sweep of history.
Right. So the question for you is, how does understanding God's entire history of working salvation, from those ancient acts of power right up to the cross and resurrection, how does that complete picture change how you perceive God's presence and power operating in the midst of the earth today?
What does that long view tell you about the kind of salvation he's still working out right now?
Exactly. Something to think about.
Definitely something to consider.